Vanessa Sue Orren was a 56-year-old from Labarge, Wyoming. She was a mother and had lived in several states. Sometime during March 2016, people who usually saw her around Labarge stopped encountering her. Her boyfriend told people Vanessa got into a truck with some men and left. She was never seen again. I'm Ed Denzel, and this is Unfound. There are many reasons to complain about the internet, and in particular social media. The trolls, the pop-up ads showing that websites are tracking your every click, the fake accounts, the comments section of virtually any news story. Of course, with what Unfound does, we couldn't do it without the internet. The irony. But one point that has certainly proven to be true with the internet since it became a thing, is people don't grow apart like they used to. For some of the younger listeners, I guess under 40 years old, there really used to be a time when you'd graduate high school, or trade school, or college, and never hear from those classmates again. Ever. You wouldn't know where they lived, what they were doing, if they died. Yes, really. On the other hand, maybe some of you would love to never hear from those people again. The internet really does make it easier to stay friends with people who you would otherwise forget about while living your own life. Well, in the disappearance of Vanessa Orren, she had friends and family. But after moving to Wyoming and getting into a relationship, the people who cared about Vanessa heard less and less from her. Then nobody heard from her at all. And we're left to wonder if her disappearance is a symptom of losing touch. And now a summary of the case. This is brought to you by my friend Megan Good's website, charleyproject.org. Vanessa Orren didn't choose the easiest of lives. She had been in multiple relationships and marriages, some of them being abusive. One of them involved her being a prostitute, with Vanessa meeting with many men for money from the late 80s into the mid-90s. However, despite all that, Vanessa managed to be a mother and eventually did find her way out of those problems. To further make progress in her life, Vanessa moved to Wyoming to be closer to family. There she met a friend of the family, Pete Petrie, and they became a couple. However, into the later years, 2013, 2014, Vanessa started to show signs of what happened to her earlier in her life, with Petey seemingly blocking her from those who cared about Vanessa the most. So in 2016, roughly around the time of March, people started to realize they hadn't seen Vanessa in a while. In April of that year, Pete told multiple people that Vanessa had left him. In fact, Pete said she had left with a couple of men headed toward a nearby town. Yet Pete claimed to not know the men. He never explained how they met him or Vanessa. Pete didn't even know their names. She was never seen again. It wasn't until much later that someone finally filed a missing persons report regarding Vanessa. Some points of Pete's story have changed over the last 4 years, but generally it remains the same. Vanessa left town with some men. Anytime you have a case where there isn't a clear disappearance date and a missing persons report isn't filed until many months later, there are going to be many hurdles to overcome to get a firm grasp on the facts. In this episode, Unfound will attempt to do that. And it all starts with these questions. Number 1, if Vanessa was in some kind of trouble, why didn't she let her family know? Number 2, Why would Pete allegedly just let Vanessa go off with some strangers? And number 3, what are we to make of a guy, not Pete, who had one of Vanessa's most important possessions, but who didn't turn it in until 2018, even though he knew Vanessa was missing? Vanessa's family is convinced that foul play had a role in her disappearance, and their attention continues to be on Vanessa's boyfriend, Pete. The guest for this episode is Vanessa's sister, Tinker Lynch. Unfound News. We had our 4th On the Ground episode this past Monday. If you are a premium Patreon member, I hope you got to contribute. For the rest of you, the 3rd On the Ground segment is now on YouTube for free. Next, we're quickly coming up on the first Unfound Roundtable. I'm still not going to say much about it, but myself and the assistants will be having a meeting regarding it in a couple weeks. I think you're all going to enjoy this new program once we put it together. Finally, I want to remind all of you, if you'd like to see Unfound take an in-depth interest in a particular disappearance, please contact my assistant, Emily. You can find her on Facebook. It helps if you have contact information for anyone connected to the missing person. Thanks. Where you can find Unfound. Unfound supports accounts on Podomatic, iTunes, Stitcher, Instagram, Twitter, Spotify, Deezer, Facebook, and YouTube. Speaking of YouTube, on Wednesday nights at 9 p.m. Eastern, please join us on our podcast channel for the Unfound Live Show. All of you can talk with me, and I can answer your questions. Contribute to Unfound at patreon.com/Unfound Podcast. This week, I need to thank Lynette. You can also contribute at PayPal. PayPal.me/Unfound Podcast. A note before this interview starts. You will hear an intermittent clicking during this discussion. Tinker and I did the best we could to figure out what it was, but we were unsuccessful. Luckily, it only happens for a total of about 7 minutes during this hour and 50-minute interview. I'm so happy to have on this episode of Unfound the sister of Vanessa Orren, Tinker Lynch. Tinker, welcome to Unfound.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
We have to start here, Tinker, because I know the audience is going to be wondering about this. But your name, of course, it is not necessarily your real name. I know what your real name is. How did you get the name Tinker?
My mother's father, my maternal grandfather, gave that to me. We used to do a lot of things together, and he discovered at a young age that I liked taking things apart, and due to my mother thinking what people would call now that she couldn't get a husband with excess baggage, I was left with my grandmother to raise for a while. So we were out in the yard one day fixing the tractor, and he was so delighted to have a helper, he made me this little tool belt. And he had given me little mini tools to put in it. And so here I was out there helping Grandpa fix the tractor. And he decided he was going to lay down for a nap that day, because that's what he did when the day got hot. And he said, "You going to take a nap, Grandpa?" And I said, "No, I'll start working." And of course, with me being 3, a lot of this was feedback from my grandmother telling the story, because Grandpa had passed away when all this was being talked about. So she said that Grandpa went up to take a nap, and I continued to be out there doing my little thing with my little tools around the tractor. And when he woke up, he looked out there, and whatever I could have twisted off or unscrewed or whatever was on the ground.
Oh my.
So he got mad at me, sort of. And he kind of grabbed me by the hand, and he took me in the kitchen. I was all greasy and everything. And Grandma goes, "What in the world, Preacher?" Because his nickname was Preacher. And he says, "Clyde," he says, "this child has took off more on that tractor than I'm going to be able to put back on in 2 weeks. He says, with talents like that, her name is not Debbie or Deborah. From here on out, I'm calling her Tinker. So I got my tool belt taken away, put on the top shelves over the old wood cook stove Grandma used, and I didn't get my tool belt, more or less, till he got the tractor fixed. Then he got to thinking about it, and he went out and built me a little area, and he hung my tool belt on the nail there, and he said, now, when you're in here, he says, you can use your tool belt. He says, when you're not, he says, that tool belt hangs right here. So that's pretty much the story.
Wow, so you're a tinker. That's tinkered means to mess around with things, work on things, and that's how you got that name.
Correct, and Tinker is also an Irish peddler.
Right.
And the bigger part of my bloodline is Irish.
Yeah, mine as well. Okay. So is that a name that stuck with you like through your teen? I guess so, being that you're called Tinker now, but is that a name that everybody calls you now or just family members?
Everyone.
Everyone.
My family members had a harder time accepting it than most people because they'd been used to calling me Debbie all my life.
Right. Okay. All right, well, I appreciate you telling that story. I think we had to talk about that for a few minutes. Of course, as you would expect, you were the first tinker to ever be on Unfound, so I wanted the listeners to know how you got that name, so thank you for that. But as you know, this episode is about your sister Vanessa. Let's talk about you and her. How many siblings that you had? You know, what was it like to grow up, all of you together? You know, maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Well, when all the dust settled, we ended up with 11 of us.
Wow.
There was, from my mother, there was 5 girls. When my stepdad came in 71 and took his 3 that he had fathered back with him, he married into a family that had 3 sons and a daughter, and between them they had another daughter. And then later on they adopted one that had physical issues. So basically growing up, it was mostly Vanessa. Okay, let's go down the stair steps.
Okay.
It was mostly myself, Jeannie, the one that was right under me. Vanessa was the middle child. Tana was the youngest at that time until 11 years later. What we named her at birth, Trinette Tess, was the 5th one. But during that summer, the social services came in and took Trinette Tess from us, and she was adopted out. 49 years later, or 39 years later, she popped up on a adoption site wanting to know her birth family, and she had changed her name to Darlene Coleman.
Wow.
So then later on, after all of us were kind of grown up, then I got to know my other side of the family, which would have been steps in a way. So, yeah, we've come close, and since then we've lost all 3 of the brothers, the youngest sister, and now Vanessa's missing.
Wow. That's quite a number, 11 kids, through various means, I guess. That's a lot, Tinker. 11.
Well, sometimes people tend to put too much emphasis on blood, kin, and not enough on those water kins, as they are called. And I'll tell you what, that's very wrong, because water kin can be just as close, if not closer, than blood.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Thank you. So you are the older sister of Vanessa. How many years between you two?
8, I believe. Wait a minute. 3 between me and Jeannie, 3 between Jeannie and Vanessa, 6.
6 years. Okay. So 6 years difference. So growing up, were you two close? So you would have been 16, she would have been 10, you would have been 20, she was 14. Would you say that you two had a lot in common? Did you hang out together, or was the age difference too much?
Well, shortly after, let me think, when I left Georgia. Before I left Georgia, yeah. And up until her second marriage to Ronnie Grooms, yeah. Vanessa was a good mother. She was, in fact, marriage straightened her out quite a bit, because she used to be the middle child, and every time we was going good, she'd jump in there and cause hate and discontent among the children.
Okay.
So, yeah, and there was a lot of things that she and I did during that time. The one thing that I remember particular funny is when she was expecting with her son, I call him Bo, when she was pregnant, she was so short, and her belly would get so big, and so would her butt. And she was walking away from me one day, and I was kind of following her, and all of a sudden I just cracked up. Totally hysterics. And she turned around, and she goes, of course, she was in that grumpy pregnant mode, and she says, "What is so damn funny?" And I said, "Vanessa, when you're walking away, your butt swings one way, your belly swings another, and you look like a little fat duck waddling on."
Oh, no.
She didn't like that.
I'm sure she didn't, Tinker. So I guess being that you could maybe you didn't get away with saying something like that. It does sound to me though like you two were fairly close though.
Yes, we were.
Okay. All right. What was she into? Maybe before she got pregnant and got married, did she have any particular interests, kind of music, any hobbies, things like that? What maybe in that area? What was she into? Do you remember?
She liked plants. She always has liked plants, and she liked animals. But later on with kids and stuff, animals was kind of a luxury.
Okay. All right. Did she graduate from high school? Maybe I should ask you this: where did you all technically grow up? Of course, she disappeared from Labarge, Wyoming, but I know she spent some time in Florida. I know where you live now. Where did you all technically grow up?
Right there, just on the outskirts of Meldrum, Georgia. Our church that we went to was in Meldrum. Okay. She was active in the girls' auxiliary with the Baptist church there. We did a lot of neat things.
Okay. All right. So you grew up in Georgia, and she's a little bit younger than you. She got married, I guess. What year do you remember? And how many kids did she end up having from getting married or any other men in her life?
Let's see. She must have got married sometime in the maybe the late 60s, because she had ran away from her dad when they were stationed in Illinois, and she had hid out until they moved, and then my stepfather, Jeannie, her biological dad, said, "Well, when she shows up, let me know and I'll give her a bus ticket to Georgia." So that's basically what happened. And when she come back, she was, let me see how best to describe this. She was kind of a little bit headstrong, out of control, and had already figured out what boys were good for.
Okay.
So she gave us a bit of a run for our money on that. And then one day she told Mom she wasn't going back to school the next year. And this must have been like she was in the 9th grade, maybe. And Mom said, "Oh, yes, you are." And she goes, "No, I'm not even if I have to get pregnant." Well, at that time she was dating her children's father, Danny. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. So we had one of those quick weddings at my uncle's house next door, and then her daughter popped out, about 8 months later.
Okay. All right, so that's what she did. Okay, and that happened in Georgia.
Yep.
And this was with the guy, his last name was Grooms, G-R-O...
No, Donaldson.
Donaldson was his last name. Okay.
Right.
All right. So what kind of mother was Vanessa to her kids?
She was excellent. She was very good. She put them first. In fact, she got upset with me and her husband because we kind of had interest in muscle cars together. And one day she made the comment. She says, well, if you guys spend so much time together out there with that damn car, why don't you guys just get married? And I'm looking at her like, what? Where'd that come from?
Okay. So I'm guessing then that you and she lived close to each other in Georgia when she came back and got pregnant and had these children. Then you two
We were actually at my grandmother's still. I was still in high school yet.
Oh, okay.
So that had to have been like late 60s when all this happened.
Okay. All right. And where does everything go from there? Eventually, of course, I know, I think that you got married at some point and moved out. What was she doing? Did she, being that she wasn't going to school, did she get work, or what did she do?
Yeah, she got married. I didn't. I've never been married.
Oh,
That's why my last name is Lynch.
Oh, I'm sorry. Misunderstood that.
Yeah, she divorced Danny, and I'm not quite sure what the solid reason was, but then she worked down at the Howard Johnson's on Interstate 16 and 95, where they kind of met. And then, for whatever reason, she picked up on Chrissy's dad, Ronnie Grooms, and next thing I know, they got married. So it was not a good relationship. Chrissy's aware of this now. And it was a lot of physical abuse, a lot of mental abuse. It was, once she finally told me exactly what went on, and then I heard from Tana how it was when she went there for a visit once, and I'd actually been there, and I wasn't comfortable with the man either. So when she finally got out of that, that's when the other part of her story kicks in.
Okay. Well, let's talk about the other part of her story. What is that other part of the story? What age are we talking about then here?
That would have been shortly before she got pregnant, okay, I got to backtrack a minute.
Okay.
Because during the time she was trying to get free of Ronnie, she had left the children under my mother's supervision. And my mother realized that she couldn't handle them for whatever reason, especially a baby. And she called Family and Children's Service, and they came and took Chrissy into that system. And it took her 7 years to get her back. So during that time, she somehow ended up at the 301 truck stop in, I believe it's Orangeburg or just outside of Orangeburg. And it took me a while to pick the story out of her, but once she realized that I loved her no matter what.
Okay.
Excuse me. She told me what I already knew or suspected, that she was prostituting out of that truck stop.
Oh, my.
And she had hooked up with a pimp also by the name of Ron, I think. And there the story only gets worse. She wanted to get away from him. She hooked up with one of her Johns, who happened to have been an ex-deputy sheriff of the county that they eventually moved to, which was Lakeland, Florida, the area there. And she did get away with him, but her daughter was already caught up in the glitz and glamour, so she refused to come with her. And then she sent Bo out to me in Wyoming. And of course, Chrissy was still in the system at that time.
Okay. Wow. That seems like a little bit of a downward spiral there, Tinker.
Well, the reason she told me that she sent Bo out there, and later on Bill confirmed it, Bill Carter, her third husband, is that the pimp had made a threat on her life and told her there was a contract out on her 3 children, or her 2 children that left with her.
When did you find out that she was prostituting herself? Is that something she told you, or did you find that out later?
I suspected it because of the way she was dressing, the money she was flashing around, and this Ron guy that she was living with at the time. Because Jeannie and I had actually went out there for a visit at one time, and neither one of us got any good vibes off of him. So that I suspected. And then when she finally come forward and told me about it was when we went back for my grandmother's funeral. And that was like, I'm trying to think. I came back from Antarctica in 89. My grandmother had passed away. Let me see, I'm trying to get my timeline straight here. I had worked for a mom and pop refinery called Thayer's Oil prior to that. And so I think it was 87, sometime around there when Grandma passed away. So we went back there for the funeral. Of course, we stayed at Vanessa's, and we came up in town. I think we stayed at Vanessa's, did we? No, correction here. We stayed at my cousin's house, Joey Dickerson up there. And we met Vanessa for the funeral. We rode to the funeral in her car, and we did some talking. Well, then Vanessa kind of pulled me off to the side, and she says, look, she says, and that's also, I guess I went by myself because Jeannie was having her child. I think that was the reason I didn't go, or she didn't go. But anyway, she pulled me off to the side, and she says, look, I need to tell you something. And she gave me this little hanging thing that said, sisters are forever, no matter how bad it gets. No matter how good it gets, sisters are forever. And I looked at her and I says, what are you trying to tell me? And she goes, well, she says, I'm actually prostituting. And I looked at her and I kind of grinned, and I said, I already knew that, Vanessa. I said, it's up to you as to whether you come out with it.
Wow. Okay. How long did she continue that?
I think that when Bill picked her up after she got both sent away to me for safekeeping and stuff, I think that had to have been mid-90s.
Wow.
96.
Wow. So she was prostituting.
No, it was earlier than that. It was like 93, 94.
Still, 8 years around?
Yeah.
Of doing that?
Yeah. Yeah.
In what area again? If you could tell the listeners again what area?
Orangeburg. And I'm not sure exactly what state that's in. South Carolina, North Carolina, somewhere around there.
Wow. So what finally got her out of it in the mid-90s?
Her marriage to Bill, the fact that she was scared to death after we had come up there, and I kind of told her in leaving, I'm not really comfortable with this, Vanessa. If you need a way out, call. And that's when she started planning, and she figured if she got with someone that was had close ties to the sheriff's department, stuff like that, that Ronnie wouldn't pursue her.
Okay. And so she got out.
Yep.
And where did she go?
She went down to Florida, that Lakeland area. She married Bill, and he already had a foliage business going, but then she got into that with him, and everything seemed to really be going well for her for a change. I sent Bo back. He spent about 2 years with me, I believe, and I sent him back once she got established with that foliage business.
Okay. And how long did that continue? Right now in Florida, of course, I live in the Tampa area. In fact, I was just in Lakeland about a week ago, coincidentally. So she's with this guy. She's out of prostitution. Things are going well. How long did that continue?
Up until she told me she was suing Bill for divorce, and then shortly before she came out there to my house, 2007.
Wow. Okay. What do you think went wrong in their divorce, if you can say?
I think Bill was trying to help her. And he and I talked once, and he said, she's not who you think she is. And he told me about her habits, and especially the drinking. He said she'd stay sober as long as he was there to a point, and then as soon as he left, she was back out doing her thing. She'd do what she had to do for the day, and then she'd get really super drunk at night.
All right, so...
And she'd been in the hospital twice that Bill told me about. Only once she had acknowledged, and she claimed that it was a gallbladder attack. And when I found out about it, it was actually acute alcohol poisoning.
Wow. Okay. Do you
and
think
I think it was sometime during that time she picked up, let's just say she revisited the powder issue, because she did have a habit.
Cocaine?
Yeah, cocaine in the earlier days, I think, but I think later on it went to what they called crank back then, because, it's just an easier to get, synthesized, cheaper high.
Okay. All right, so she was been through a lot, and then she kind of straightened her life out, it seems, for maybe about 10 years, and then she kind of slipped back in that direction.
Yeah, and there were a lot of things that went on with her children in between that time, and I think whatever happened to her during her marriage with Grooms, it caused something to snap in her or change, because I noticed a lot of characteristic things in her that had changed. Okay. For one thing, she was making up lies about her kids. And that's something I caught her in towards the end.
Okay. If you can, we would not want to go into all of those, but can you give maybe just one example?
Yes. She had a lot of expensive jewelry in a jewelry box. And she didn't like the young lady that Bo was courting at the time. And so she pretty much accused Bo of breaking in the house and stealing it, when later on there was pictorial evidence in the pawn shop from the tapes that it was her herself who had been in there pawning those articles. And it made a rift between her and her son that to this day is not healed.
I would suppose so. Okay. All right, but finally she came out, I guess, to Wyoming.
Right.
And you were living there at the time?
Yep. I'd been living in Wyoming since 1980.
Okay. So let's move on to something else. We'll kind of get away maybe for Vanessa for just a moment, because that leads us up to 2007. But you were living there, and let's talk a little bit about Pete Petry, Petry. Now, of course, you knew him for several years before Vanessa and he ever met, because he's going to play a prominent part from now on in this discussion. How did you meet Pete Petry? What did he do for you? Let's just talk about him a little bit in general, what you knew about him when he was, I guess what I would say, doing work for you.
Well, he actually didn't, quote, work for me. He was a furrier. He trimmed horses' feet, did shoes, this kind of stuff. And that's how I first met him, I had lost my original furrier, and he was recommended to me, so I started using him. And he was excellent, absolutely excellent. And at that time, his son was about 3-4 years old, Ira. And he'd bring Ira up when we were talking, and it always kind of piqued my attention that he'd love to tell these derogatory jokes about women. And since I had no interest in him other than the furrier work that he did, which, like I said before, was excellent, I never really paid much attention to the jokes. Some of them I found amusing, but, I just kind of blew it off.
Mm-hmm.
But
Okay.
all that kind of changed there towards the end of him and Vanessa's association with each other.
All right, we'll get into that. But how long would you say that he did this work for you before Vanessa came out to Wyoming, and then she and Petey, I guess, became an item? But how many years was that before she came out?
Right around 20.
Wow. So since the 80s, he had been doing this work for you on your horses.
Pretty
Okay.
much. And then really intensely after I bought that place up Labarge Creek, which was August of 90, I believe.
Okay.
Because at first he was coming out of Kimmer.
Okay. So would you say the only interaction you had with him was when he was doing work for you? Or would you say that, did you ever happen to run into him? So you just knew him as somebody, a casual work. Once again, he wasn't an employee of yours. He was doing work for you on your horses. But I guess being you kept him for 20 years, you had no problems with him, even if he was telling some derogatory jokes.
Right. Because like I said, I've worked in male-oriented work ever since I graduated high school, although at first it wasn't a male-oriented job. I was a clerk typist for the Fire Investigations Division, Savannah Fire Department, but it was just myself and one other female there who was the secretary for the chief, and so I was constantly surrounded by men. Then from there, I left and came out, and then I went to Spokane, and I got into the Carpenters Union. So, at that time there wasn't hardly any women doing that.
Right.
And then I left there, come to Wyoming, got into working rigs, oil field, and the women there were few and far between back when I first moved down there.
Right. Okay. So would you say that you and Pete had become friends?
Yeah.
Okay. And did you know of any women in his life over those 20 years before Vanessa moved out there? Did you ever talk about going out with any women, being married, anything?
Yeah. He had several women come and go over the years. So, yeah.
Okay. All right. Just trying to, we just need to know for the audience how well you knew him and your impressions of him. And it seems to me if you kept somebody around, working on your horses, you must have trusted him, quite a bit. All right. So Vanessa moves out to Wyoming. You already live there. How did things go once she moved there?
Not real well at first because she brought this other man out there with her, and he was kind of a bird of a different feather. And my common law husband at the time, Tom Nelson, he didn't like him, and so there was friction there. And then she moved him up here to Streeter because I'd been looking at some property up here. And she was expecting to be able to, if I could have got that deal going then, to move out here and help me with it. So once she got him, she moved him up here. She paid for the house out of her money that she got through the divorce and all this kind of stuff, and basically got him out of there before Tom blew a head gasket.
Okay. So how did this relationship, being that she had this other guy, I guess he somehow went out of the picture, how did it end up that Vanessa and Pete Petrie became an item?
That's kind of funny, because when I first introduced her to Pete, he was just coming out of the convenience store gas station across from the post office, and he was sweaty and dirty. It was summertime, warm weather. And I introduced him to her, pardon me, I'm getting tongue-tied. I introduced her to him, and as we were driving away, she made this comment to me. She goes, I said, so what do you think? She goes, I wouldn't touch him with a 10-foot pole. I said, really? I said, he cleans up nice, because he did. I mean, Pete wasn't an attractive man.
Okay.
So this was how that kind of, and so I just dropped it.
Okay. And but somehow, though, somehow, some way, they did become an item. What exactly happened to this other guy that she moved out there with, and how did Petey slide into that position?
I'm laughing because it turns out that this individual who I referred to as Frog Lips, he turned out to be a cross-dresser. And then later on, after he split from up here and she had to come back up here and get her furniture, he ended up entering the gay community in Fargo, North Dakota.
Okay.
Don't that
All
make
right,
you
well,
want to throw your hat in the crack?
Well, I guess that's self-explanatory then, I guess. So he did that, and what did you think when Petey and Vanessa became an item?
I know exactly what I thought. I thought that Vanessa was working him. Because what happened was Jeannie had rented a place for her, and then she went in and her and Wayne fixed it up. I think I went over there a couple times to help, and it kind of surprised me one day when I went over there and saw Pete helping with the interior there, the woodwork and drywalling, because he's really handy as building things, working with wood and stuff. And I thought to myself, And that's when I first realized that he was in the picture to whatever extent, but he was in the picture.
Okay. All right, and how did you think
that would have been, let me think,
please.
That would have been the late fall, early winter of 2008, because she moved out of my place saying that she needed to be closer to town to find work. And then next thing I know, she was holed up in Jeannie's fifth wheel, and that didn't go too well. And then we tried to get her in the house, and mainly that was because she had already showed up for work once, a little bit under the weather, and she was given a second chance, and she eventually ended up getting fired from that job.
Okay. So when you said that Vanessa was working Petey, she was kind of working her way into his life so she'd have a place to stay? Is that what you mean by that?
She was looking to escape the fact that she could be watched there in Labarge, and we were trying to get her help, to go into some kind of a program or something. And there'd been various calls about seeing I'm getting ahead of myself. And so I think that's a lot what drove her to this, because she realized that it didn't work with Frog Lips. She had picked up on another one of my friends while she was staying with me, John Montoya, and he was Native American, and he liked Vanessa. He didn't mind her drinking, but he found powder in her purse one time. He don't like getting things out of women's purses, he says, because you never know what they keep in there. And when she asked him to get her cigarettes out of there, he's like, well, okay. But in the process, that fell out.
Wow.
And he blew up at her, and he said, look, I'll put up with the drinking. He says, I'll put up with the cigarette smoking, but I will not put up with this.
Yeah.
And so he washed his hands of her and left.
Okay. All right. So, but Vanessa and Petey do become a couple, and how did that go? You're saying like 2008, 2009, 2010. Is he still working on your horses, and they're a couple? What's going on?
Okay, this is where it gets kind of interesting, because she had really messed up. Like I said, she got fired. And we went over there to talk to her, because Jeannie and I were both both willing to carry her for a while. And she was really drunk that night. And so we figured we'd have an intervention of sorts with myself, Wayne, and my sister Jeannie. And we went over there, and I think I may have scared her because I grabbed her by the shoulders and said, look, I said, I cannot let this go. You need to get help. I said, and you are not going to die on my watch no matter what. And I guess I grabbed her by the shoulders and I kind of shook her. And then when she got free of me, she ran behind Wayne and was peeping out behind Wayne. And she says, I'm not going anywhere with you. And I'm like, fine. And so that was pretty much the end of that. Next thing I know, she's packing her stuff up, moving up to Pete's. And that would have been like January of 2009, I believe.
Wow. Okay. And how did it go from there?
Well, for a while she got her job back down there in Labarge at the convenience store gas station, and it seemed to be going pretty well, except for all of a sudden, she's when she first goes there, I see her with a laptop, I see her with her own cell phone, all of this stuff. And then it seemed like it wasn't that long before all of a sudden she couldn't use the laptop. She couldn't use her own cell phone. She was pretty much reduced to using Pete's phone or a phone that was on Pete's plan.
Do you think
that's what kind of got me paying attention to exactly what was going on? And then the attitude started changing because he approached me one day at the gas station, and this had to be like summer of 2010 because that's when I started working for Woody. And he come up to me and he says, you need to back off of Nessie. He goes, I don't know what your problem is, but all of you sisters just seem to pick on her. He says, I ought to pull you out of that truck and beat your ass right here.
Is that
and
right?
I looked at him and I'm thinking, okay, what's up with that? But it was because I had called in a drunk driving report on her because I seen her leave, and she was leaving town, and she was weaving all over the road, and in the headlights in the street lights coming through the windshield, I could see her with a bottle tilting it up, trying to drive at the same time. Well, by the time the call was answered, she was already back into Sublette County, and there was really nothing that could be done as far as pursuing it.
Wow. And so Petey might have found out about this call and given you a hard time.
That well, yeah, I'm sure of that because I'm sure that Lincoln County passed it on to Sublette and they had to go kind of do a Q&A out there. I'm not really sure. But, yeah, it was basically that.
Okay. And regarding this phone, what you said about her using his phone and everything, was that like a control thing, or was she not paying the bill, or what was going on?
Well, I don't know what was going on because she started collecting unemployment off of Tom and I's company at that time. So she was getting unemployment, and she claimed to be getting part of the money from the bobcat sales and stuff like that, the animal bobcat sales, because Pete raised and sold domesticated bobcats. So I'm not really sure if that was it or if it was just a control factor, because I had taken my company phone back shortly after she moved out of my house downtown to Jeannie's because she got drunk one night talking to a fella here in Streeter, Dan Murdoch, who had helped her out when she come up here to get her furniture, and she passed out, and I got a 4-hour phone bill for that phone at 33 cents a minute because it was on roaming.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, that couldn't have been cheap. All right, so they're in this
No.
relationship. Sounds like maybe some things are going on. Petey's giving you a hard time about not cutting her some slack, or however he wants to put it. So she and Petey are in this relationship. He's giving you a hard time about you looking out for her. She's probably drinking and driving.
Yep.
Is it some point in here, though, that you and Petey have a falling out, that he ends up not doing your horses anymore? Did that happen?
That actually happened shortly before that. I can't remember exactly, but I remember I had to start using a different furrier.
Okay. Do you think that would have happened had he and Vanessa not become a couple?
Nope.
All right. So you think that them becoming a couple was directly led to him not being your furrier anymore?
Yep.
Okay. All right. So what was, if you were still, what was Vanessa telling you? Your overall perception of this relationship. We're going to have to move this along a little bit. How was the relationship? 2011, 2012, 2013? They're
It
sticking.
got increasingly obvious that she was being isolated from friends and family. She had cut off ties with all of her close friends that used to call her quite a bit when she was up there with me. She wasn't allowed to take phone calls. It was, and she kind of, from what I understand from talking to people that have told me that they heard him threaten her in work situations, it's like she was scared again. And in 2014, as far back as 2014, Dan Murdoch, in fact, I just talked to him yesterday. He said that she had told him, he listened to this story about, him being possessive, not letting her do this, and had to be going everywhere with her and all this stuff. And he said, well, why don't you just leave him? And he said, she got kind of quiet, and she says, I can't. He's threatened to kill me. And I guess he wanted her to elaborate, and he goes, what? She says, I can't. And I guess her voice got lower, and she says, he's threatened to kill me. He told me that if I tried to leave him, he would kill me and nobody would find my body. And Murdoch, I know this for a fact because Murdoch then called me shortly thereafter, and he says, what's up with Vanessa? This is what she did, and this is what, and I'm like, by that time I was really starting to get concerned, but she wouldn't talk to anybody. The last time I actually seen her was the week before Tom died. And
when was
Pete
that?
Brought her up there.
When was that?
Tom died March 8th of 2012.
Okay.
And so she had come up there to say goodbye to Tom, and Pete kind of brought her in the house, but he never, ever let her out of his sight. He was standing right in my doorway, and Tom was set up in a hospital bed in the living room so he could look out the living room window. And then I take that back. I saw her once more again. She showed up for the memorial service on the 24th and was there vaguely. And then all of a sudden I hear these stories circulating about how she said I had said some derogatory things about her during the funeral or during the memorial service, which was not true. And all I did was told a humorous story about this Rottweiler she'd brought with her and how he had led us to Tom one day when he had dumped his power chair over and couldn't get back up. So anyway, that's basically when I last saw her.
The last time you saw her before she disappeared, and we're of course taking that to be in 2016, you didn't see her for 4 years.
No, because the middle of 2013, I moved up here to North Dakota.
Oh, okay. All right, so you moved. That was probably a significant factor. So what you're saying is after you moved to where you live now, she never came and visited. Did you two talk on the phone?
No.
Wow. So you had no communication with her at all? Zero?
No, other than what Jeannie would tell me about running into her, and then they made a trip back to Florida to get the rest of her possessions from there. And this is the pattern I talked about later on about she never dropped this pattern. She'd always get her driver's license, get a checking account, put in a change of address, and continue her life. And this didn't happen once it come to my attention that she wasn't being seen around there.
All right, we'll get into that. So you moved out of Wyoming in 2013. She's still there with Petey. You don't see her again because she never comes to where you live now. You don't go back to Wyoming. And it seems
no,
like
and she threw every birthday card or anything I'd try to send her in the garbage before she ever left the post office. The postmaster told me that.
Okay. So she basically wrote you off, and you're going to have to remember tell the listeners again, who is Jenny again? Who is that?
Jeannie?
Jeannie, yes, please. Jeannie.
She is my sister right under me by my mother.
All right, but so Vanessa was seeing, or maybe your other sister, or talking to her?
Right, because that's what she'd do. She'd try to, if she got mad at one of us, she'd befriend another one, and then, if she got mad at that one, then she'd try to be friends with another one, and it didn't always work because we caught on to it pretty quick.
All right. And likewise, of course, Vanessa has some children. Was she keeping in contact with any of them?
Not so much, because like I said, her son had pretty much washed his hands of her, and her older daughter was having her own issues, but I think she may have called once in a while, but Chrissy was the one that called the most.
Okay. So she's very isolated. She's like, she has, Vanessa seemingly just had Petey in her life, and that was it.
Pretty much.
Okay. Now, something else, though, that you had told me that I'm going to make sure we cover before we move any further is that they were living together, but did you tell me that Petey would not allow her to keep anything of her own in the house?
Correct.
Why don't you explain that a little
Jeannie,
bit? Yeah, please.
Well, she had told Jeannie, because Jeannie had went over there on one of the calls Pete made to her about he didn't know what was wrong with Vanessa. She was not, he didn't know what was, well, anyway, to make a long story short, she went over there, and normally Vanessa likes her elephants. She collected elephants, tables, chairs, you name it, elephant, it was hers. And none of them were cheap. So it got Jeannie kind of curious when she went over there that the only things that Vanessa was allowed to keep in the house was one small elephant statue somewhere in the living room, and then in the bathroom there was a towel rack with the elephant ends on each side of it, and that was the only thing she had in there of her collection. The rest of it was over in a bin, a grain bin, just east of the house. And Jeannie thought that was kind of strange because she had emptied out the box truck she'd moved up there in, and that's where it got put because she was trying to sell the box truck and that Dodge van I'd bought her. And I think she ended up, and there was a little pull-behind trailer because when she came to Wyoming, she had that box truck plumb full and the trailer too.
All right, so it seems that Petey would not allow her to hardly keep any of her own things in the house. They had to be stored outside somewhere.
Yes.
Okay. All right, so we got this going on. She's not keeping in contact with her kids too much. Of course, you explained why that might have been with her son and what happened there. You moved away. You're trying to send her birthday cards. The postmaster says that she's throwing them away or whatever was going on there. So how
Right.
is it then that somebody finally realized that she was, missing? For a woman who's seemingly isolated, not talking to anybody, couldn't find any friends, or how did this all get started that people actually started looking for her?
Well, she had the tendency, she used people to burn her bridges. What did it? What initially got me to really looking on my own at first was the fact that Teresa, which would have been my niece, she said that one day she was over at the post office and Vanessa come walking from across the street, and she actually started a conversation with Teresa. And until Pete walked out of the gas station across the road, the same one that she'd been fired from, etc., she said that she was kind of comfortable with the conversation, and she was acting like she was wanting to reach out to Teresa, And then as soon as Pete walks out, she goes, "I gotta go." And she turned around and went back across the road. Teresa found that rather strange, so she was hoping she'd run into her again, which she never did. And then one day she was asking around, and it seems like nobody had seen her.
When does Teresa remember this conversation being? Is this the March 2016 sighting?
Well, no, that was from a different person. She said she remembers it being cold, and she can't say for sure, but she knew it was after the holidays. So based on that information, I'd have to say it was around February.
Okay.
Late January sometime.
Okay. So somebody that you trust, this being your niece Teresa, just happens to run into Vanessa. She's by herself for like a minute, and then Petey appears, and Vanessa says, "I gotta go." And the best guess is that happened in February 2016, and maybe we can get to the other alleged sighting of her a little bit. So when is it then that finally somebody does realize that Vanessa is missing? Was it you? Was it Teresa? Was it Jeannie? Who?
It was Teresa, and it was triggered by a statement that was made to her by one of the people working at one of the little delis for another convenience store there.
All right. Well, please explain that. And this is in Labarge, Wyoming.
Correct.
All right.
Correct.
What did Teresa? What was the content of this conversation that Teresa had with this person?
Well, this individual had been a police officer in Labarge earlier, and for whatever reason was no longer doing that. But she said it really struck her as funny that Pete come in one day, and he says, "Well, I finally got rid of Vanessa once and for all." And she kind of looked at him, I guess, and he says, "Yep," he says, "she took off with somebody in a pickup truck today." And then in the course of the conversation, while he was eating his lunch or picking it up to go or whatever, he's made the statement again, and this time the story switched. This time he had took her to Painter's store, and two guys in a pickup had picked her up, but in both cases she was headed for Rock Springs. So
okay. When was this conversation that Teresa had with this person? What month? I'm guessing
it had to have been like around the time that she noticed she wasn't showing up, and this person had actually been mulling this conversation over in their head for some time before actually telling Teresa about it.
Okay, well, I'm asking you,
so
when
I heard about it was like in May of 2016, and that's when I said, "And you're just telling me this, Teresa?" She goes, "Well, been kind of busy. She's got disabled children, and they were starting a new business for themselves, her and her husband. So, yeah, this is when I said, okay, I said, I'm going to get on it right away and see what I can find."
Okay. And with this person that Teresa talked to, this person, did he or she say that this was in April that Petey said this? Was it in March? Was it like right before Teresa had this conversation? When did?
Best that my niece can remember, it was right around March, the end of March, 1st of April.
Okay, so
That, the best of her knowledge, and you can't. That's not gospel because, like I said, everybody's busy.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was during that time, and then when I started looking for what I could look for or pay for on the internet, for as far as Social Security dings, change of address, this, that, and the other, the only thing that came up was a change of address, and it didn't make any sense.
So let me, for the listeners, just put this in a little bit of a timeline. So Teresa's out and about in Labarge one day, let's just say in February 2016, and she runs into Vanessa. They have that conversation. PD comes out, Vanessa leaves. Then in, let's just say April or late March of April of 2016, so a month and a half later, PD is in at this store, this convenience store, whatever it was, and he makes this statement to a person there about, yeah, Vanessa left with some guys, and of course the story is, of course, a little shaky, and there may be some discrepancies there. But he says, yeah, Vanessa's gone, yeah. And then at some point after that, maybe a month later, Teresa goes into that same place, and that person relays that story to Teresa. And then she talks to you.
Right.
Okay. So then you get involved, and what do you do?
Well, the first thing I did was I went online, and I put in her Social Security number, nothing. Then I put in her driver's license for Wyoming, nothing. And I can't remember who said that they had checked. Well, I think it was I had asked the post office if there was a change of address, and they said at one time they had, but they had no record of it. So that means that it had to have been like a paper thing, and after a year it was lost or put away, and nobody thought to even ask about that till later. And then I know that her driver's license should have been renewed in September of 2016, and it never got renewed.
Okay. All right, so you're looking into these things. Did you have a phone number for PD? Did you try calling him? Did Teresa go find him and ask him what was up? Anything done at that time? And let's just say May of 2016.
No, because at that time I knew what the attitude was of Pete towards me, and I kind of figured if I tried to call him, I'd get the same reaction. So, no, I really didn't. It was later on when I tried to call that I realized that maybe it was an active number, and then I thought, well, maybe he changed the number and someone else ended up with it. So I'm not real sure, but in the beginning, the one phone number I had for Vanessa, I called it and it said it was no longer in service or had been turned off or whatever.
Okay. Did you call the local police, whoever, sheriff's officer, whoever, and ask them to go up to PD's and make like a welfare check, as I guess is what they would call it? Go up there and see what the heck's going on.
Actually, Teresa done that.
All right.
After we got to talking about, and this was, I think, along about the same time in 2016, and then when we got into 2017 was when they did the missing persons report that originally came across as a missing person or a welfare check because of the forms not being filed correctly.
So I have to ask you this, being that you brought that up. Why did it take so long to get a missing persons report officially filed if already, like, once again, May, June of 2016, that, you suspected that something weird was going on here? Why did it take that long?
Because I guess it took me that long to realize that maybe it would carry more weight if one of her daughters or son could file that report, because I was afraid maybe I'd just get viewed as being overreacted, and I know that Chrissy had been asking me about her off and on all during this time, and it was like I think I actually waited till 2017 or the fall of 2016 to tell Shannon and Chrissy that their mom was, in my view, their mom was missing, and I'm not quite sure what happened.
Okay. So this report got filed, but also there was this welfare check. The police went up there, and what did PD say? And when did this happen?
Well, from the best I can gather, the deputies that went up there, because there was twice that this happened, they weren't real comfortable with his answers either, and he changed answers on them. But at this time, it was just a missing persons report, and they were allowed to talk about it at that time because it was not a missing persons. Correct me. It was a wellness check, and so in that case, they can discuss this stuff with you.
Okay. So but PD, just to be clear though, he said that he told this person in April or May of 2016 that she went off with a couple guys, never used their names, and then later when this welfare check, wellness check, said the same thing, still did not offer up any names.
No. And he also kept getting his last time he talked to her or before she left or something like that, that kept changing. It went, one time it'd be January, one time it'd be February, then one time it'd be this part of March or that part of March, and he was not consistent at all. And the more they'd ask him, the madder he'd get, or the angrier he'd get.
Okay. But the report was filed. Did anything get moving because of that? Any progress? Of course, we know, being that we're doing this interview on August 3rd, 2020. Obviously, this is still an unsolved disappearance. But any movement at all once an official form was filled out for her going missing? Anything done?
Well, other than going out and checking and then going back and asking questions, and then a second deputy entered the picture about a year later, and it kind of was at a standstill because they had no real evidence to link her to not being there, other than the fact that she'd just vanished. And this, in defense of the sheriff's department and their detectives that worked this case, she had disappeared before for lengths of time, but she had always left a paper trail, and she had always contacted someone. She had never just fell off the face of the earth and nothing.
Okay. What do you think had happened those other times when she disappeared for a while? Do you have any? When did that happen? How long ago it had been? Do you have any information on any of those other disappearances?
Well, I know at one time when she was trying to get away from Ronnie, she had fled to a friend of hers, and even there, she had managed to cover up a few things. And here again, she would always contact someone, either my mother or she had a friend in the Carolinas that she would keep in contact with later on. But this time, nothing.
Okay. All right, so you get this form filled out. Petey's sticking to his story, doesn't have any names, has a very general story. But on the other hand,
very vague.
Very vague.
Very vague.
Very vague, but on the other hand, unfortunately, in her history, Vanessa did have a, at least going back to the 90s, history of prostitution. And, you and I have even talked about, the possibility that maybe Petey had her doing the same thing, possibly.
Yes, and it they're just things that I can't prove, but I can sense.
Mm-hmm.
Because one of the things she brought up, and she brought it up in a joking way when we were talking about this moving to North Dakota and my possibly having this place and stuff like that. She says, well, you know what? If we get short of money, you and I can run over to those oil field towns over there, like Williston, and she'd heard about Williston and Minot and all those places. And she said, you can kind of like be my watch out, and I can pick up the tricks, and then you can sit back there and take money and stuff, and then if anything happens, you can call somebody. And I'm like, what? And she goes, well, it's an idea. And I'm like, Vanessa, I said, the first thing would happen is I'd probably laugh my ass off. I said, and the second thing that would happen is there ain't no way.
Yeah. All right, so I guess you're kind of making my point there, that being that she had this in her history, it's not totally out of the realm of possibility that she could have gone maybe with a guy or a couple guys if she was back into prostituting again.
Yes.
Okay, but of course it is strange that Petey didn't seem too bothered by it when she didn't come back. I guess that's the corollary to that.
No, and it was kind of to me it almost sounded like he was bragging.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, so she's gone. Petey has his story. He's moving on with his life. He doesn't seem to be bothered. He has his story, and unfortunately, it seems because she became so isolated, a lot of people who deeply cared about her didn't figure out that she was missing until 2 months, 3 months, even longer than that later. Okay.
Right.
Let's move on to this. Now, there is a possible other sighting of her once it got out there that she was missing in the Labarge area. We know about the sighting in maybe February by Teresa, but somebody came forward, unfortunately it was quite a bit later, saying that she saw Teresa at the post office maybe in March of 2016. Maybe you need to talk a little bit about that.
Oh, you mean Vanessa? That she saw Vanessa at the post office?
There was somebody that came forward in 2017, you told me, who was thinking
right.
back. Yeah,
it was Tammy Walthow, and I had posted some posts on Facebook when I realized that there was nothing coming. This was after Chrissy had filed the missing persons report, and finally got a missing persons report instead of that wellness check. And I had put this on Facebook. And so when I put it on Facebook, there was an enormous amount of responses, well wishers and things like that. But this one lady that had worked for me before and that I trusted, and she was well known in the community. Her name was Tammy Walthow, and she had said that she could for sure say that she had seen Vanessa, and she figured it had to be sometime around the middle of March or somewhere like that. She wasn't real sure of the exact date, but it was in March. She was in front of the post office. She was in the red Jeep Cherokee that Pete drove around, and it was her and Pete in the Jeep together.
Okay.
And that was 2016.
Okay, so this would have been after Teresa saw Vanessa, but this is before, of course, Petey started telling people that Vanessa went off with some other guys. Okay, but we have to remember this is a person who didn't come forward till very long later, and maybe she could even be off by a month or maybe even 2. We just don't know. But
correct.
But I guess the most important part is this person is trustworthy. They may be wrong, but they're trustworthy. They're not just making something up.
Correct.
Okay. All right, let's move on to this. Once again, we know that Petey has never identified the men, if that even ever happened. Has he ever even stated, did they leave from the house? Were they out somewhere? I mean, how specific has he gotten with this story? Where were they when Vanessa got in the truck with them? I mean, how specific did he
The one
get?
story that they picked her up at the ranch there at his place.
Okay.
Nothing was ever mentioned of possessions going anywhere, nothing. And that was somebody in a pickup truck, a man that he didn't know in a pickup truck, picked her up there. They left for Rock Springs. The other one was he took her to Painter's store, which is right there at, and I can't remember the highway number. It's the cut across road from 189 to the road that comes in, that heads south to Rock Springs. But anyway, it's a crossroads. And he claims that he took her there and two men in a pickup picked her up there and took her to Rock Springs.
Okay. Still no idea how he knew these guys. No saying why they were at his place or wherever they were. No explanations whatsoever. Just some guys in a truck.
Pretty vague.
Okay. Let's move on to this, and I think for the purposes of this interview, we're not going to use his last name, but there is a guy named Robert, and let's just talk about him. What you know about him. We'll get into some things, but when Vanessa was still around before she disappeared, Robert, who was a local there, and Vanessa had an encounter. Why don't you explain about this and tell how you found out about this, and then we'll bring him back into the story about what he found later. Robert and Vanessa, he found her walking along the road one day before she disappeared.
Right, in the bar ditch. It was between the dirt road off of the highway going into Pete's place and town. And he had stopped to see why she was walking, I guess, and she was pretty bad beat up. And so he picked her up, and she refused the clinic, so he took her over to a friend of mine's, Big Tina's, and left her there. And that's when the Sublette County got involved again, the sheriff's department. But in the meantime, I kind of found out about this because Jeannie had told me that Jack had covered for him to cover his field and stuff because they worked together as contractors out there, so that he could at least get her to some place to where she could get some help.
Okay. Do you have any idea of this Robert guy who lived close to them? Do you know if Robert and Vanessa had known each other from before then, or was this the first time they ever ran into each other? Any ideas?
I really don't have any idea.
Okay.
I know that he was friends with Pete and his son Ira.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Because, like you said, he is a local.
Right. So he did know Pete and Pete's son Ira decently well because they were neighbors for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I don't know how long they were neighbors, but I do know that Ira is kind of close to Robert's age, so I know that they knew of each other and socialized.
Okay. And then Robert's going down the road. He sees Vanessa there. How did you find out about this story? Did you not hear about this until after she disappeared?
Right.
Okay.
Until after she disappeared.
Okay. So we have this Robert guy that you find out about later, and I think the reason you found out about him is what we're going to talk about next, is that at some point, well after she disappeared, Robert came forward with Vanessa's, this is out of nowhere, Vanessa's day planner, something that you claim she took it everywhere she went when she moved. had a lot of names and phone numbers and everything in it. He comes forward with her day planner of all things. Why don't you tell the listeners about that?
Well, I guess from what I understand from what Teresa had said, that her and her husband had just come in from a day's work, and they were going to stop at the Eagle to have a beer or two before they went home. And they were sitting around, and the conversation kind of was going from one thing to another, and I guess Robert said he had something for her, and he walked back out to his truck and brought this day planner in. And it belonged to Vanessa, and he said that he didn't realize that that was my sister, or that was her aunt. Correction, that was her aunt. And he had just kind of had it bumping around in the back of his work truck all this time, and so he brought it in and gave it to Teresa.
Where did he say he found it?
He told her that he'd found it in a pond just above the area where Pete's place is back there. A spring-fed pond, while he was setting trail cams.
Huh. And it was just lying there, or was it? You had told me.
No, it was in the water, and he told her he thought it was garbage at first, and that the garbage turned out to be that day planner and a purse.
So he's up there, just coincidentally, comes by this pond, and it couldn't have been, I guess, very deep or very big. He sees the day planner in it. He gets it out, gets the purse out, but he only takes one of those items with him.
No, I think what he was doing, and this is just a supposition.
Okay.
A lot of people set these trail cams out, to watch the game and stuff like that, because it's a big hunting state. And I think what had happened was he initially thought, what the heck is somebody doing throwing their garbage in this pond? And he had went in picked it out of that little area and threw it up on the bank, thinking, well, I'll come back later and pick it up on my way back down. So this was, here we go again with the, I don't really know, but Robert, all the knowledge I've always had of him, he's a pretty decent guy. So I'm not sure, but anyway, it turns out that the purse wasn't there when he come back down, and the day planner was the only thing that was there, and he picked it up.
Okay.
And then he'd been carrying it around until the point that he says that he became aware of the association of this day planner with Vanessa missing, and the fact that she was Teresa's aunt. Aunt.
Okay. Now we should make something clear. He was not on Petey's land. He was on what you called Bureau of Land Management land, like government land?
Correct.
All right, so it wasn't like he was trespassing or anything. However,
No.
This planner was found near Petey's land where he lives.
Correct.
Okay. Now, I guess the big question is, being that Robert knew Vanessa from their prior encounter when he picked her up, did he not realize that she was missing, and did he not realize that was hers?
According to him, what he told Teresa that night, and this is, once again, this is second, third-hand information.
Right.
No, he didn't, but to me, I don't understand how he couldn't not know, because he worked with Teresa's brother, Jack.
Right. So that's why I'm wondering. I mean, if this was New York City, I can understand why Robert wouldn't know about Vanessa going missing, because there's so many millions of people there. But being Labarge isn't very big, of course, you and others were publicizing Vanessa being missing, and Robert is almost practically a next door neighbor, even though it's I'm guessing his house is not close to Petey's. It's just weird that he would find that day planner, have it for a while. No, had to have known that she was missing, and then continue to hang on to it, until 2018.
Yeah.
All right. So what you're saying is we're doing this once again on August 3rd, 2020. You still don't have a very good explanation for that.
No, I don't.
Okay. All right. Did he actually say? Did Robert ever say exactly when he found that day planner? Was it in 2016? Was it in 2017? And the listeners should know I'm going to, between now and when this episode comes out, when you end up hearing our voices, I'm going to be trying to call Teresa, who talked to Robert about this, to get her side of this and, her recollection of it, so we can be a little more exact on this. But I've not talked to her yet. But do you know when Robert found that day planner in that water?
It is my understanding it was sometime within a period of time right after the last time she was sighted in Labarge, around March, early April,
Wow.
somewhere around there of 2016.
Okay. So shortly after the last sighting of her, Robert's up there, he comes across her day planner and then hangs on to it, seemingly until 2018, so for at least 2 years, almost 2 years, at least.
Yeah.
Okay. Have you personally, Tinker, ever talked to him one-on-one?
No, I haven't.
Okay. All right. Before we move on to some other items, you mentioned that not only was the day planner, which has proven to be Vanessa's, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but this purse was there. Do you know if Robert ever described the purse to Teresa or anybody else, and is there reason to believe that could have also been Vanessa's?
At one point in time he did. I'm not sure if it was Teresa or exactly where I heard it from.
Okay.
But it was a leather one, and it pretty much matched the description of the one she was carrying at the time when she left my place.
Okay. So there's reason to believe, of course, leather purses are very common, but there's reasons to believe that it probably was Vanessa's, especially considering that the day planner was there as well.
Yes, because Vanessa didn't carry a common purse or anything. She always liked the Western look, the motifs, that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time that she left the house, I know that she was carrying one that I had given her that was similar to the one that was in the description I heard.
Okay. This day planner.
And there was also some stuff missing out of that day planner when I looked at the pictures that John and Teresa had taken that night, because this is another interesting thing, because nobody around there really trusts the police. They didn't then because of other things in the past, and she called me at first and she said, "Who do you trust for me to turn this over to?" And at that time it was a Lincoln County matter, and the two people from Lincoln County that worked with law enforcement there, one had retired and one was currently employed, and I'd helped him with some stuff in the past as far as being a witness. So I told her, I said, call Lincoln County Sheriff's and ask for JJ. I said, him I trust. And so that's what she did. But in the meantime, her and John had taken pictures of it, and she always carried extra pages in it for notes and stuff like that. Okay. And in view of how well preserved all the other stuff was, I was under the impression that those had been removed prior to it being, and this is my verbal opinion, dumped there.
Mm-hmm. And so what you're saying is when the daily planner was found, it was in pretty rough condition.
No,
It wasn't.
I don't think so.
Okay.
Because okay, you go ahead and.
I was going to say you sent me some pictures of it, but of course I don't have it in my possession. I've never seen it in person. But what would you say the condition of the day planner was in when it was found?
I would say at the time, considering that I'm under the impression it was found shortly after her disappearance, that a lot of the business cards were legible. They were paper. And if those are still legible now, or at the time she sent me the pictures, which would have been in, I'm trying to get a timeline on this. I guess it would have been like 2018 or 2018.
Okay.
It would have been April of 2018.
All right.
That being as how they were readable, and even the envelopes that had become waterlogged and dried out over the time that were kind of faded, I could still make out addresses on them good enough to tell where those addresses were related to and who they were sent to.
Right.
So if those pages that she'd had in there, she'd usually carry like some extra one of those notes pages like you see in the back of those planner refills, and then she would carry notebook paper in there. But none of those were in none.
Okay. All right. So even though it's paper, has ink inside, it's outside there at least for a little while. We know how quickly if paper gets wet and ink, it can start running. And I've seen some of the pages, and they're fairly legible. Fairly.
Yes.
Fairly legible. Okay. All right. So we got this purse that might have been hers, but somehow it vanished later. I guess when Robert came back, he just gets the day planner. Eventually, passes it along to Teresa and her husband. I want to ask you this. Is this day planner something she would have carried in her purse, or is it something that was separate?
No, it was separate, usually. Well, wait a minute. Let me retract that. It depended upon what she was doing and the size of the purse, but at the time, the size of the purse she had, I would say, yes, it probably could have been fitted in there. But it was not found inside the purse.
Right. Right.
So I'm assuming that it had either gotten too bulky for it to fit in her purse along with her other stuff, or for whatever reason at that time she'd had it out.
Okay. All right. So those two items are out there. I'm guessing that Robert didn't see anything else out there. And it will be up to the listeners to determine, what that all means. You had said that Vanessa did have a cell phone at one time, but she was not using it at the time of her disappearance. She was using Petey's or someone else's, or
mostly Pete's if she made phone calls out, because he seemed very interested in monitoring her. He had this possessive, controlling attitude with her.
Okay. All right. So we can't really talk about any cell phone or ping information because she wasn't using her cell phone. We certainly couldn't get a hand on Petey's information. Was Vanessa using any social media at the time?
Yes. She, not at the time of her disappearance, but leading up to and prior, she was on Facebook. She and I and a couple of friends, we used to play that little Farmville thing together, and that was kind of how I was kind of knowing that she was okay and stuff, but that even quit.
All right. So we can't really look at social media. I guess what you're saying is we can't really look at social media to say well, it cut off on this day, and so that could have been the day of her disappearance. Nothing like that.
Right. And it was interesting when that change of address come about, that change of address was the same address as Pete's, except for the first letter had been changed. Instead of being Gath, it was Rath Road.
What do you think about that? Any insight into that, why that would be?
Misdirection.
All right, so what you're saying
Someone other than Vanessa had filed that change of address.
and when was that change of address filed? Do you know?
The best I understand was probably April.
2016.
Mhm.
Okay. Somebody went in, and we've all, at one time or another, if we've moved enough, filled out one of those change of address forms or hold the mail forms. And you are saying that somebody filled one out and used the wrong letter at the beginning of the road.
Right.
Okay. Now, there's this. After she went missing, we have to remember what you said, and other people have said, that most of Vanessa's stuff was not in the house. It was stored outside of it. Was there a fire at Petey's place after she went missing?
Yes.
Tell the listeners a little bit about this.
Well, according to what the volunteer fire department said, and my niece Teresa's husband is on the volunteer fire department, it was claimed that it was started from sparks from a cutting device.
All right. And is it your understanding that only Vanessa's stuff that was still stored there were the things that got damaged, or something else?
No, consequently not, because those are metal grain bins, and the fire spread around them.
Okay.
And it came really close. My understanding is it came really close to his house.
All right.
It went across some areas where he had carcasses out there in preparation for making his bait or his scent for his coyote traps.
Okay. So did any of Vanessa's things get damaged, or what happened to her stuff after she went missing? Do you even know?
As far as I know, he still had it, because I wrote him a letter back, in December, and put a check in it telling him I'd like to pay some kind of a storage fee or something on her stuff, because he had got in contact with Jeannie earlier about coming and getting it, or else he was just thinking about pulling it out and burning it. And Jeannie did not get back up there to get it out of there, because she just had her car to haul things with, and she needed time to make arrangements to get it. But this had been when I found out about this, it had been 6 months after the fact that he'd talked to her. So I was going to offer to pay him $25 a month to store her things, and that if he cashed that check, that meant that he'd received it, because I didn't really have a post office or anything to mail it to him anymore. And so I never heard back from him. I have no idea if he got the letter. But as far as I know, at the time of that fire, her things were still in there.
Okay. Being what went on, whether Petey had, I think a lot of people are going to hear you, Tinker, and think that he had something to do with it, her disappearance, especially since he has this very, you're using your word, which I agree with, vague story about her going off with some men, and it doesn't seem like he was concerned that she never came back, didn't try to look for her, didn't ask for anybody's help trying to find her, nothing. Being that you knew him for 20 years before they became a couple, did it surprise you when he became so controlling of her when they became a couple? Was that a total surprise to you, or maybe looking back, is that something you maybe could have predicted? How do you look at that now?
Oh, I was floored. The reason being is because he had been through some difficult times before, and he was raising Ira by himself, and he had quit drinking for a long period of time. And then when all of a sudden I heard that he was drinking again, and that a lot of this abuse came when he would be drunk and they would be arguing and whatever, I was like, what the hell is going on?
So it really does, even
and
though...
I did consider him a friend because he gave me a lot of good tips on training horses and stuff when he was up there. And like I said, in his defense, he wasn't always like this when I knew him.
Right. No, I have to agree with you. I think that if you thought that he was a shady guy or abusive of women or anything like that, I don't think he would have been your furrier for 20 years.
And I definitely wouldn't have introduced my sister to him.
Right. But then these things happened. Once again, we're not saying that he did something to Vanessa, but we can't also deny that his story, once again to use the word, is very vague. It doesn't have a lot of context. It's just she got in a truck with no idea why these guys were there, no their names were, where allegedly where they were going, when they were going to bring her back, nothing. Okay.
No, and there was never a mention of her coming back to pick up her stuff.
Right.
And there's no explanation of where the van went that she was trying to sell, where the nothing. It's like there was no explanation for anything.
So what you're saying is this van that she had, it's gone. It vanished too?
The van is gone, the box truck is gone, and I had my brother-in-law ask about, or not ask, but I said, Wayne, you haul water and stuff out there all the time crossing that road, and he goes, well, not so much anymore. I said, well, could you at least drive through there and see if any of that stuff is still there? And when he drove past there, he said it wasn't there. In fact, he got his binoculars out and was looking, and he said Pete was sitting out on the front porch with a shotgun across his lap.
See. Okay. So are you thinking that he sold that van and that box truck and kept the money? Any insights into any of that?
I don't know, because I had been looking at satellite photos a couple years, and even I think I started looking at those in 2017, 2018, because I was sending links to what I'd found to the sheriff's office. And I could have swore I saw two distinct shadows in those pictures that would and could have been those items. But then later on, I asked a relative of Wayne's to go look and see if she could see them, and she said they weren't there.
Did anybody have the VINs on these vehicles that they could do a Carfax search or something like that?
Yes, I did, and at the time I offered them up to one of the detectives that had went to do the wellness checks, and never heard back.
Okay. So he could have sold them, but the VIN tracing hasn't been done. Do you think it's been done? I mean, because even people...
I don't have any idea.
No
but
idea.
I do know that the last time I heard, they were in both her and Pete's name.
Okay. All right. So if they were both in Pete's name, he could do with them what he wants. But we're just. It's a little strange. She goes missing, and then this van that she was using goes missing as well. Sometimes. Okay.
Correct.
What has Petey done with his life since early, or let's just say May 2016? What has he done with his life since then? It's been over 4 years.
I don't know, because from what I understand, he's really crippled up now from arthritis in his back. As far as I know, he's not working steady other than maybe trapping, something like that. And I just don't have a clue. Like I said, I tried to reach out to him to pay for the time he's kept her stuff there, and hopefully to be able to go back down and claim it so that I can at least give something, bring some part of her back to her kids.
Yeah. Okay. Was it just the two of them living there during those years? You had mentioned his son Ira. Does he also live in the area?
He did up until just recently, and I wasn't even aware of that until I was looking at some Facebook posts and recognized the terrain. And it seemed kind of odd to me that after they'd had a falling out earlier over him thinking she was a gold digger trying to get her hands on Pete's land, he was actually in and around there. So then I tried to contact him once or twice, but the numbers that I had for him also were not current, and I don't know if he's even in the area anymore.
Okay. His name is Ira, and his last name is Petry, Petry.
Yes.
Okay. The reason I ask that is that, if Petey did do something to Vanessa, say it's just something that was an accident, you're telling me that he's crippled up and, maybe lacking in some strength. He might have needed some help.
Correct.
So the first person that Petey would probably go to is somebody he could trust, quite a bit, and that would be his son, especially if the son maybe was suspicious of Vanessa from day one.
Correct.
So, okay. That's just the only reason I was asking. Once again, only asking because it's Petey himself who came up with this story that, she took off with, these guys in the truck. That isn't something we're cooking out of thin air. That's something he came up with himself, and it just, there just seems to be a lot of, once again, vagueness. Okay. What has the last 4+ years been like for you, Tinker?
Well, at first, like I said, I thought maybe, she just picked up and pulled up stakes and relocated, but when there was no pings on anything, and her daughter Chrissy did also try checking on that, then things just, I kept hearing stuff about his behavior, and then that thing where it sounded like he was almost bragging about getting rid of her, the bruises, the beatings. I want answers, but I also want the person responsible to answer for it, no one else. And I've tried to give her children answers. I've tried explaining it, and it takes my attention away from my life. It takes my attention away from a lot of things that I should be focusing on right now. And it's actually kind of miserable.
Yeah. A lot of, now of course you're talking about your sister. Of course, as you would suspect, I have a lot of mothers and fathers and children of missing people, and that is a word that comes up, miserable. It's hard to believe that, they all find it very hard to believe they're in the situation that they're in.
Yeah, and there's been so many misdirections, so many. One of the things that I usually do is try to check missing persons things, and there had been a lead that had popped up. Some was saying that they'd seen her in Rock Springs, some over on the res, some down in Colorado. I mean, it's been like there's that seems like the closer I get to finding answers, the more misdirections come.
A lot of rumors
And
and
it's
things
not,
like that.
I just, I know that people are listening to this, and I would really like for them to put themselves in my shoes. What if it was their sister? And granted, a lot of people don't get along with their siblings, but I'm asking people that get along with their siblings. What would you do if this was your sister, your mother, your niece, your aunt, or even your grandmother, because she actually had grandkids? So, what would they do? Wouldn't they want somebody to come out? And I know that Labarge is a tight-knit community. I realize this, and that might be the reason that some of the people that you've tried contacting about this hasn't returned calls, is because of that. But they really need to think. No matter what they think of me personally, no matter what they thought of her personally, no matter what they think of Pete or any of the other people or players in this, they really need to think. Wouldn't they want answers?
Yeah.
I've stuck my neck out for people before, and I'd do it again.
I once again, Tinker, what you're expressing here is a lot of the same thing. You, of course, have talked about the local law enforcement, which it doesn't seem like you trust too much. I know you have an investigator that I'd like to talk to before, this airs, but overall, you've been frustrated with them?
Overall, yes. But the one thing that sets this one investigator aside is that when she was taken to Big Tina's and the call come in, he was the one that went down there and checked it out.
Mm-hmm.
And so he had personal knowledge of her size, the condition she was in that day, all of that stuff. And so, in a way, he feels like this is not just another case with a number. This is somebody he can actually put a face to. And I know that they don't just talk to anybody about anything. And he said that he was kind of suspicious of even me. And he asked around about me, and he said nobody had a bad word to say about me. Well, either he didn't ask the right people, or they were afraid to say anything bad about me for whatever reason. But yeah, this, in all honesty, given credit where credit is due, Sublette County Sheriff's Department have worked on this case, but it isn't like this is the only case they have. And since, especially over the last 6 months, they are to coin a phrase, they're like a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs. So they're doing the best they can with what they've got and the time and the finances. But I am very grateful to them that they have not let this go cold case. I am very grateful to them that are supporting the deputies and the detectives in their searches. And I think that the sheriff down there, Sheriff Lair, I really would like for him to know that I appreciate him supporting these detectives. So, that being said, I guess we've about done all we can do.
Yeah.
As far as this podcast, all we can do is hope.
Yeah.
Just hope that somebody can give us some solid evidence.
When was the last time, if you've even been there, when was the last time you were to Labarge, Labarge, Wyoming?
2013.
All right, so you've not gone back there since she went missing to show up, to speak to the police like face-to-face, or even try to go up to Petey's place to talk to him, or look around, or talk to Robert. You've not been there, not been back.
No, and I was cautioned that if I ever did, that I needed to kind of take somebody with me. And that was just on sound basis of the fact that he was acting so bizarrely.
Right. Yeah, if he was sitting out in front of his place with a shotgun for no particular reason, then yes, I would say that you really need to watch yourself.
Well, it seems like after that fire sometime he got a little more paranoid than normal for whatever reason, and this is just going based on reactions from people. Like some of the firefighters that was there, like I said, my brother-in-law just checking for me to see if her vehicles were still there after that fire and stuff like that. So, yeah, that's pretty much where we're at.
Okay. What has been the response? Of course, you talked about all these siblings and everybody, all these other brothers and sisters that you have. What is their overall reaction been? I realize maybe some of them are not with us anymore, but what has their reaction been to all of this?
Hopeful. It's hard to describe. It's the waiting, the not knowing. You know, we have no body to bury, and we have no person to hug.
Yeah. Now, you do still have family in that area. You talked about Teresa, so you do have family still in the Labarge area.
Right.
Okay. How many?
I have. Well, Teresa, the niece, and Jack, the nephew, still live there. My sister moved to Kimmer here a couple of years ago, so she's in the area, but that's the blood relatives I have there.
Okay. All right. Do you have a Facebook page or anything like that?
Yes, I do.
For Vanessa's disappearance. Well, if you do, why don't you let the listeners know about it right now?
It's not a page per se. It's just my page on there.
Okay.
And I have told them that they can IM me because now I do have a smartphone, although I'm still trying to learn to use it. And I have a lot more capabilities of transferring this information to the Sheriff's Department from downloads and stuff, or a much quicker way, a more precise way to get it to them.
Okay. And what is your personal Facebook page? If you're using your Facebook page, your personal one for Vanessa's disappearance, what is it?
It is Tinker, capital TINKER. The number is 83123.
Okay. Okay, so that is your. Why don't you say that one more time for everybody, Tinker, please?
It's Tinker, capital TINKER, numbers 183123.
183123. Okay.
Yes, and my posts are all public, and if they just Google my name and, you know, I'm real easy to find.
Okay.
I'm not hiding from anybody.
Okay. We should just say that you use the name Tinker Lynch on Facebook, correct?
Correct.
All right, and that's LYNCH.
Correct.
All right, and as people would probably guess, there aren't too many Tinker Lynches on Facebook, so she should be easy to find. Okay. So
yes.
Use that, and I would just suggest, I say this to other guests, if you do not have an official Facebook page for Vanessa's disappearance, I think I would never, of course, say you gotta have one, but I would certainly suggest it, just as an idea.
Okay.
Just as an idea.
I will get on that here real quick.
I would think that you can do both. Both have your private Facebook page and have a page that is exclusively dedicated to Vanessa's disappearance and all the information, flyers, maps, and whatever else. Of course, links to this podcast, everything else that you could accumulate to put on there. I think that would certainly be worth it if you wanted to do that. Any last words before we complete this interview, Tinker?
Yes, I want whomever is responsible for my sister's disappearance to know I will not quit looking for her. And no matter what, I will continue to reach out to anybody and everybody that might know of her, seen her, possibly seen her. I'm not going to quit looking. It took me 39 years to find my sister that got taken into the social services system in Georgia, and I'm willing, if good Lord willing, the creek don't rise, I'm willing to spend that much time again, because I'm only 66, and I figure 40 years I'd be 106, something like that. I'll still have my faculties, and I'll still be looking.
Okay.
And don't think for 1 minute I'm going to give it up.
And we're not, at Unfound, we're not going to allow you to give up. And in fact, I hope that we can help you in any way possible to make that. Because we're not going away either, Tinker. So hopefully we can help you as well.
I appreciate that, Ed.
You're
and
welcome.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And listeners should know that after this interview, I'm going to be trying to contact a couple of the people that have been mentioned during this interview. So hopefully we can add that as a supplement for this episode before it airs.
Yes, and if Pete's got anything to say, I encourage him to come forward.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Because I have no problem with him saying his piece.
Absolutely. Okay. Tinker, thank you for being on this episode of Unfound.
Thank you very much, Ed. And I'm looking forward to getting some answers and maybe helping other people along down the road in whatever way I can. Because I'm going to become retired here pretty quick, maybe. And I would love to be able to help these programs out. So thank you very much, Ed, and thank you to the listeners.
Great. We need all the great people we can have in this community, so you'd be very welcome here, Tinker, for sure. Very welcome.
Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
And that was my interview with Tinker Lynch, sister of Vanessa Orren. I thank her for joining me and all of you on the program. As I stated in the interview, I wanted to speak to Vanessa's niece, who still lives in Labarge. She is the one who received the day planner from Robert. I got to do so. This is what she said. Teresa was at a local hangout. Robert came up to her. I got the impression they knew each other before this encounter. Robert said he didn't realize Teresa and Vanessa were related. At that point, Robert gave Teresa the day planner. This was sometime in 2018. Teresa got the impression that Robert had the book with addresses and numbers in it for a while. Robert claims his kids, or at least one of his children, were fishing in a pond on his property. This contradicts what Tinker said about the pond being on Bureau of Land Management property. That child dragged it in at the same time as when the purse was also dragged to shore. Somewhere in there, the purse disappeared, but Robert got the planner. However, the description of the purse generally matched one Vanessa had. I asked Teresa if she inquired as to why Robert kept the planner that whole time. She said it really didn't occur to her, and Robert didn't volunteer why he had it that long, or why he didn't turn it in to the police, even though he knew Vanessa was missing. The day planner did look like it had been in water for a while, and I posted pictures of it on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. As I stated before, Teresa and Tinker did disagree on one important topic. Teresa said that the pond was not on Bureau of Land Management property. The pond was on Robert's land. So essentially, Teresa believes the book was found on Robert's property, while Tinker believes the book was found on Bureau of Land Management property. Make of that what you will. And that was the extent of my talk with Teresa. Also, Detective Ian Allen called me the day before this episode came out. We talked for about 15 minutes, although he told me that due to Vanessa's disappearance being an ongoing investigation, he couldn't say much. However, Ian did tell me two noteworthy items that I can pass along to all of you. First, although we used March 2016 as the month in which Vanessa disappeared, Ian believes February, if not the whole way back to November 2015, is a more likely window in which she went missing. And second, he says there is much more to the story regarding the day planner, how Robert found it, and how it got into Teresa's hands. That's all he would say. Ian says he is committed to figuring out what happened to Teresa, and he is not going to let it slip through the cracks like so many disappearances. I believe him. And that was my conversation with Detective Ian Allen. So, what do I make of everything we heard in the interview and what Teresa and Detective Allen told me? It's hard not to believe Pete did something to Vanessa, or at least he knows what happened. Certainly, we've all heard the, oh yeah, she just took off stories many times on Unfound. But to play devil's advocate and remind you of the reality of disappearances, we've said many times on Unfound, adults are allowed to walk or ride out of their lives. And it very well could be that Vanessa met a couple guys and took off with them. And why didn't Pete get worried when Vanessa didn't come back? It could be, it might have been good riddance. Not to be harsh, but given that this episode is called Losing Touch, we've all had people who we wish we'd get out of our lives, but don't. So it could be that when Vanessa met these unknown men and left, Pete was like, thank goodness. Really, if Pete wanted Vanessa out of his life, there would then be no reason to try to get her back. To go even further, and if many of you are to suspect Pete, the behavior of Robert is puzzling. He knew Vanessa is missing, but hangs on to her address book anyway, for a year, and then comes up with a story that his child caught it while fishing. I guess it's possible, but Robert seemingly gave no explanation for him keeping the book. Yes, Teresa didn't ask. But would it not be the first instinct of an innocent person to just give a reason without being asked? You'd think so, because your average innocent person would understand how shady it looks to be in possession of something that a missing person owns. Right? Or maybe I'm losing touch. I'll leave the theorizing up to you. And that's the program. If you found it informative, please go to the app that you use to listen to Unfound and give this podcast a nice review. I thank you for listening. I'm Ed Densel, and you've been listening to Unfound.